Grazie e prima di tutto buonasera a tutti. Devo ringraziare Richmond, gli organizzatori di questo evento, per l'opportunità di tenere un discorso di apertura ad un evento così importante. And I've lived in Italy now for 10 years, so in one sense I have no excuse for not speaking Italian. And tomorrow I'm going to be working in some workshops with you around incident response, and I promise I will speak Italian. But for this evening, when I'm going to be speaking probably for 30 minutes or so, I thought that it could be damaging for your ears and difficult for me if you had to listen to this English accent so strong for the evening. So for this evening, excuse me, there is simultaneous translation, but I will speak English, and I think from the looks on your faces, you understand me in any case, no problem. So, I've done this sort of speech before dinner, keynote speech, opening the conference. So I know that three things are expected of me. The first thing is that I kind of set the tone. You know, I'm a nice, sympathetic guy, so everybody feels relaxed and happy. That's the first important thing that I have to do, make you relaxed. The second important thing I have to do is, of course, to give a kind of overview of some of the subjects that are going to be covered in this cyber resilience conference. And again, that's no problem. I'll try and cover from my perspective, which is probably a little different from an Italian perspective, some of the things that are keeping me awake at night. So I've ticked the first two boxes, as we say in English. The third box, however, troubles me. And it troubles me because my main job this evening is to send you into dinner feeling optimistic and positive. But we're talking about cyber resilience. How is it possible to send people out of a talk like this feeling optimistic and positive? And I think there are three reasons why we face difficulties in cyber resilience, but more generally in corporate security, as I would see it. The first reason is the international political situation. Not since 1945 have we seen so much uncertainty, even during the dark days of the Cold War, which I remember very well, being of that age. We've got the first full-scale war in Europe, if you discount the Balkans, which was not the same as one country invading another independent country. The situation is really dangerous in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere. And then look what is happening with China and the increasing confrontation with America. Some of you will have heard of the American theory of the Thucydides trap. Is war inevitable between the rising power and the established power? A subject for discussion on its own. And the Ukraine war running as a thread also through my second theme, which is the economy. We had the huge financial crisis in 2008. We were still feeling the reverberations of that crisis, and certainly you in Italy and in Greece and other southern countries in Europe were feeling the reverberations when there was COVID. And then we were hit by the Ukraine war with all the impacts that that had on oil, gas, generally energy imports. At a time when people like you, because I don't work in a corporation anymore, but people like you are looking for investment. And my experience in corporate security is that one of the first things that they look to cut when there's a financial squeeze is security. At least that's my experience. So international politics, economics. And the third thing, perhaps you wouldn't immediately think of, but I think is almost equally important, and that's culture. There is a very worrying development of a kind of lack of confidence, increasing lack of confidence in democracy, which is being reflected by young people. I'm thinking post-millennials. Millennials are now old, so we're talking about Generation Zeta and so on. people who just don't think like we do about the world, and certainly whose attitudes to jobs and to working in corporations is different as well, put alongside the fact that, and Italy has this particularly bad problem, there is a skills shortage and a lack of education in scientific subjects that is really worrying for the future. So put all of these things together, and it's difficult to start you off on an optimistic note. My favorite person in recent American politics was Donald Rumsfeld, and you will always remember Donald Rumsfeld, who would stand in front of an audience and would say, "I don't know when, and I don't know where, but something horrible is going to happen." And you kind of have that feeling almost in his other famous phrase, "Shit happens," excuse the word, but there's a lot of that stuff flying around at the moment as well. So what I'm going to try and do is, I've got to talk a little bit about the negatives at the beginning, of course, but I want to end up perhaps on a more positive note by talking about some of the things that I think we can do. If I can make this work. So my agenda is this. What I want to start out by doing is talking a little bit about the security risk landscape, and I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine, because I think Ukraine has taught us some very interesting lessons in the cyber world. Then I want to talk about some future risks, specifically quantum computing and artificial intelligence. I know that Alessandro Vitale, who probably is in the audience, is going to be speaking about AI specifically tomorrow. So saving his presence, because I'm certainly not an expert, I will talk a little bit about that and its implications. But then the good news is that I want to end up with a call to action, because there's a lot of things that you can be doing. Unfortunately, we're going to find out that quite a lot of the things I'll talk about you already know you should be doing, and some of you are not doing them. But that's a different story. So let's start with some basic stuff. The security risk landscape, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think particularly for this audience, there's not going to be very much new for you in it. So looking first of all at what are the most common forms of cyber attacks, what are the components of cloud breaches? Cloud is becoming a very worrying factor. And what are the impacts of cyber breaches? So that's my initial agenda. I'm sorry, I tend to organize my lectures in this way because I was taught how to give lectures by the British Army. And the British Army had a theory. It was in 3 parts. The first part is, tell them what you're going to tell them. The second part was, tell them. And the third part was, tell them what you've told them. So you'll see slides at regular intervals which will tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you, and then at the end there'll be a recapitulation. I'm sorry, it's just the way I was taught. So what are the most common forms of cyber attack? Malware, of course, and I put this paper, which has just been published in the UK by the National Cyber Security Centre and the National Crime Agency. You can find the link on LinkedIn if you're interested. But ransomware, I think, is currently the most well-known and worrying threat that we have. As I say, that paper just published, and there are numerous other studies. And I find now that I'm not in corporate security anymore, I have a great luxury. I have time to read this stuff. And I know that if you're actually running a security department, you don't. So you have to come perhaps to lectures like this to try and pick up as much as you can on the run. There is far too much literature out there, and finding what you need to read and what is really useful is actually quite an art. But if we talk about ransomware a little bit, of course, I don't need to tell you, it's been around for about 15 years. It's not new. The first properly organized ransomware attack was probably in 2013. And over the 10 years since then, what we've seen is a very fast development of the way in which the technology is used and the development of the attack technology itself. Where we are now at the moment, again, I don't need to tell you this, is that there's perhaps less emphasis on the ransom in ransomware and more emphasis on data theft and extortion. So the data is stolen, and this means that the criminals don't need to hack all of the systems in the company. They just go for the data, so it's quicker for them. And they can also do it automatically, which is, again, also quicker for them. There's also a new tendency, which I think came after the Colonial Pipeline event. You'll remember in 2021, a huge ransomware attack on part of the critical national infrastructure in the United States. This created something that serious criminals don't like, which was a great deal of attention from the FBI and American law enforcement. In fact, I don't think anybody is still quite sure exactly what happened, but it looks as if the ransomware group initially behind the attack were actually taken down, perhaps with the cooperation of the Russians. Remember, this was before Ukraine, when Biden and Putin were still talking to each other. In fact, they had a meeting in Geneva in 2019 where they actually talked about cyber attacks and were developing, it seemed, a kind of gentleman's agreement on how to do it less to each other. More generally, this is from CrowdStrike a few months ago. What are the most common forms of cyber attacks? Well, I've talked about malware, and I'm not going to run through these. Are we going to be able to give copies of the slides to people? Because I see, rather than you having to take photos, if that's helpful, the slides will be available afterwards. But as I say, this is taken from a recent survey, and would anybody add anything to that? Got it right, more or less? I think probably yes. It covers most of the ground. Yep. Perhaps under phishing, that's covered there. We're going to talk about phishing in a minute. But I think probably it captures it. What are the principal components globally of these things? I'm very glad that the first speaker from Altea used the same statistic, 74%. But you'll find in the course of this lecture that I don't trust statistics very much, especially when it says 74.3% or something like that. Because who the hell knows? Frankly, it could be 74, 78, 79. What interests me is that I try to choose a statistic from a good source and then track it over the years, because even if it's not particularly accurate, what interests me is how it is moving through the years. The other thing to say about this 74% is it depends on my audience, because people who are selling security awareness products will say, no, Richard, it's 90%. And the technical people will say, no, Richard, that's probably about right, or even less, because what's important is the technical component in all of this. I'm going to talk at the end about the fact that the human factor is something that we all need to be concentrating on, whether it's 74 or 90, who cares? Oh dear. They originated from things that we already knew about and hadn't done anything about. I'll come back to that again in a minute. 95% have financial gain as their prime motive. Well, no surprise there, perhaps, because serious criminals, and even less serious criminals, are making a very great deal of money from the attacks that they're putting on. But there has been some discussion lately, which I'll return to in the context of Ukraine, about the fact that more political motivations are becoming into play as well. And then finally, and this is a horrendous statistic. Sorry, can you see? 70% of businesses were victims of ransomware attacks globally, and ransomware type malware is involved in over 62% of all the incidents committed by organized crime actors. My source here is Verizon, as you'll see at the bottom. I like Verizon for a particular reason, which was that I worked for a long time for Vodafone, which at that time was a minority major shareholder in Verizon, and we started this project, this annual report, together in about 2010 or 2011. And again, the statistics, you can argue with them, but what I'm interested in is trends. Are they going up or down? So let's look a little bit at the cloud. Because, of course, everybody's moving to the cloud because it's great and it's cheap and it's secure, isn't it? Successful breaches, 82% had a cloud component. 39% include data across different environments, but including cloud. And oh dear, again, cloud misconfiguration. And I've spoken to some CISOs who are still uncomfortable about things that have gone wrong in their companies as a result of misconfiguration, leading to the initial attack. What are the impacts of cyber breaches? And again, I'm looking from the Verizon data breach report, which comes out around about the middle of every year. And what I want to do is look at some of these statistics and then perhaps talk about them a little bit. Again, I don't trust this statistic particularly because I don't know what it means. Some companies who do this sort of analysis put a cost per data record stolen and then multiply it by the number of data records stolen. Verizon don't take that approach. They try to look at the incident as a whole and what it might cost. But in any case, Italy, you'll be pleased to know, comes number 8 in the league table. And the important thing is that you're better than Germany, you're better than the UK, and most important of all, you're better than the French. Malicious insiders are the most expensive cause in cyber breaches. There's only about 6% of cases come from malicious insiders, but they cause by far the most damage. And phishing, not surprisingly, comes second in terms of the cost when there is a breach. And I saw a few days ago that Comcast have done some research which suggests that around 67% of all breaches start with someone clicking on a seemingly safe link. And that explains why adversaries begin 80 to 95% of their attacks with a phish. Globally, the top sectors that are attacked, I think no particular surprises there. And I guess all of those sectors are probably represented here. And finally, and this is to me always the terrifying statistic, the number of days it takes a company to detect an attack, 197 days, is a long, long time. And then you have to add another 69 days to that, on average, before the attack is identified, remediated, and contained. Getting towards 9 months. Very, very serious problem. So if I summarize what these slides might have shown you, the first one is that the cost and the intensity of cyber attacks remains constantly rising. The 10 principal attack vectors that I mentioned at the beginning haven't actually changed very much if you look at them over several years. But of course, the engineering and the ingenuity and the changes that have been put into that with heavy investments from people who, after all, criminals have a lot of money to invest, is making these attacks more and more difficult. And we, the guys with the white hats, the defenders, are more and more on the defensive. And the quote that I always give here was the famous quote, when the Irish Republican Army in 1984 almost killed Mrs. Thatcher. You remember the explosion in the Brighton Hotel. They put out a statement, the Irish Republican Army, the next day, which basically said, we only need to be lucky once. You, the defenders, need to be lucky every time. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in at the moment. I said that I would say a few words about Ukraine, and in fact, if there's time, I'd like to go into it in more detail because I think Ukraine is a very interesting case study of cyber war, or was it, or is it? Because if we look at some of the initial lessons, it wasn't what we expected. And I think that's true of a lot of people. I think what we expected was that the Russians would have a sophisticated, we could say, combined operations approach, which would mean that cyber would be integrated with military, with air force, and with naval operations to give, as I say, that combined approach, all working closely together. What was predicted was the killer app of cyber in the invasion of Ukraine, and it never has really happened in that way. We can discuss the reasons for that later, because I think it's a very interesting subject. And to give you a clue, I'd say the two principal reasons were Ukraine, like Estonia, had had so much experience of Russia that they'd built up a pretty good defense. And then when the invasion happened, of course, NATO jumped in, and support, particularly from the Americans, the British, the Australians, the Five Eyes, in terms of all the intelligence that they had about Russian cyber, was a huge help. And then I think the second thing from the Russian point of view was that the people who designed the really serious cyber attacks, of course, needed some time to get those attacks set up. Those people, because of the way that Putin invaded, were never given very much notice that the invasion was going to happen. So they didn't have the attacks prepared on the shelf, ready to go, that you might have expected them to have had. But again, we can talk about that if there's time at the end. State-on attacks are intensifying in every sphere. Well, even without talking about cyber, if you just talk about old-fashioned human intelligence, the KGB, MI6, the CIA, and so on, there's a huge amount of that going on in every sphere. And unfortunately, the same old mistakes are being made. This was a nice one for me, which was that there is a company in the United Kingdom which manufactures high-security fencing for government and military installations, so a sensitive supplier. Unfortunately, they were using Windows 7 computers, and that was easily hacked, apparently by a ransomware gang. But I'm going to say a little bit longer, in this war situation, when so many other factors are involved, how do you know if a ransomware gang isn't actually an SVR, a Russian military intelligence gang, under another name? You've seen signs of that as well in Italy, and I'll come to that in a moment. The extensive use of co-opted non-state actors, well, hacktivists, if you like, or they could also be criminals. A lot of people on both sides, actually, because the Ukrainians had success in hacking into some of the major companies in Russia at the beginning of the war, and also managed to interrupt for about 10 minutes at a time programs on the Russian state media, inserting pictures of Russian bombing and atrocities. So the Ukrainians have also been reasonably good at this. And of course, on the other hand, the Russians, you've seen this in Italy, in ministries, in government departments, and in major parts of the critical national infrastructure, attacks which may or may not be state-directed. And finally, targeting of organizations. I mean, Italy is not a combatant in this war, nor is the UK, nor is Denmark, nor is Norway. All of them have been under sustained cyber attack. I mentioned Kleipich there because, and let me just find the quote. In January, in a Kleipich report, Kleipich commented that the geopolitical tensions sparked by the war in Ukraine had had significant reverberations on cybersecurity, with massive campaigns at the international level targeting critical infrastructure, financial systems, and other businesses. I mentioned the famous attacks. It was the day after Meloni came back from meeting Zelensky in Kiev. There was a mass series of attacks. I don't think it was a coincidence. These attacks included phishing, malware, and disinformation. Kleipich detected a 138% rise on the attacks registered in 2021, and I think one or two of the colleagues touched on that in their presentations before I started. All of this came to my mind when I saw this Clusit chart in the Clusit report from this year, because I think it makes things look too neat. Cybercrime on the left, and then right the way through. I think the trouble is that very often these things are mixed in together, and you don't know when an information warfare attack is being developed by cybercrime, or an espionage sabotage attack similarly, or whether it's by hacktivists. So it's nice to have a clean statistical chart, but I'm not sure I altogether trust it. Any questions or comments on what I've said so far? At this point, I'm not going to tell you what I've told you, not yet. If anybody wants to make a comment in Italian, I'll probably understand and I'll probably be able to answer, so don't feel inhibited that you have to speak English. Okay, so we've talked about what's going on at the moment and we've depressed ourselves pretty much. Let's look forward. Oh, I am going to tell you what I've told you, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you next. Okay, so I want to talk about the future, quantum computing, AI, and specifically, future cybersecurity threats to 2040. I say the GPT view because I carried out a little exercise with myself. I went to ChatGPT 4 and I said, give me an idea of future cyber threats to 2040. And of course, it comes back with the two conditions that cover itself. Well, I only know anything up to September 2021. And the other thing is, I can only work on the basis of future threats, future trends, and I don't know about future technological development. But that given, this is the list of 15 that ChatGPT came up with. And I promise that I don't write all my lectures with ChatGPT, but I do use them regularly to sense check to make sure that I'm not missing anything. And in fact, it's very useful for that. Just a comment or two on the ones in blue. Some of these really seem like science fiction, but we can foresee them, I think. Biohacking, if people have chips planted under their skin for whatever purpose, prosthetic limbs which are cyber controlled, you could imagine that those could be attacked. Deep fakes and digital reality manipulation. I have not seen this talked about in Italy, but in Canada, the US, and the UK, there is a nice scam going on. And what happens is, usually about 11 at night, a grandmother or a grandfather gets a telephone call from their grandson or granddaughter. And it's their voice, except your voice sounds a bit strange. Are you okay? Yeah, I've got a very bad cold. But it seems to be the voice of their grandchild. And the voice says, look, I'm in a terrible mess. I'm in city X, 50 kilometers away. I've had a car accident, and unfortunately, I've knocked over a pregnant woman, and she's really badly injured, and she's gone to hospital, and I'm here with a lawyer, and the police have arrested me, and I need some money so that I can pay the lawyer. And in the Canadian cases, they actually send somebody to the grandmother to collect the cash. It's incredible, and people pay. And you can say to them, but the obvious thing was for you just to say, yes, dear, put the phone down and call them back. But in the pressure of the moment, in the emotion of the moment, of course, people don't do that. Except now it's being more publicized, and people are catching up with that. Deep fakes are with us, and this is going to be a continuing threat. Number 11, brain-computer interface threats. Same sort of thing, I think, as biohacking and cybernetic threats. Environment manipulation. Well, as more and more geoengineering is being put into meeting environmental threats, then they will be vulnerable to attack. And we've already seen, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, alleged Iranian state actors doing reconnaissance visits to dam installations in the northeast United States. And I'm sure that they didn't have any good reason for doing that. So let me move on and focus a little bit more on these first two, because I think they're particularly interesting. Quantum computing. Is there anybody here who understands in a deep engineering way how quantum computing works? Thank goodness. Okay. I'm going to keep this very high level. I certainly am not an expert, but I would claim to know what the principles are and what we need to think about. Okay, so this is where you have to do a little bit of work for me. And the beauty of doing this is that it's anonymous, so you can be honest, okay? I'm not asking you to put your hand up. and potentially shame yourself. Ooh, very interesting result. Are these results going to be stored? Because as I do this in more and more conferences, it's interesting to build up the statistics. I'll give you a couple of more minutes. Okay, so it seems to be settling as a kind of overwhelming no. Okay, this is the first question. I think the colleagues outside are manipulating the slides for me. So let's call it 89. Here's the next one. More or less the same. All done. And then my final question. Yes, I'll laugh at this question. I think I know the answer to this one. Okay, thank you. Very interesting results for reasons that I will explain, because I think this is not a future risk. The implications of this are already with us, and we need to be thinking about this now. So this is what you're all going to have in your offices in 10 years' time. This is a quantum computer. This is from IBM at the end of last year. And as you can see from the extraordinary kind of science fiction picture that it presents, it's incredibly sensitive, and it's incredibly sensitive particularly to noise. So if your office is next to the Messe, or if it's next to the car park, this thing isn't going to work, because what happens is, with noise and other environmental problems, it produces a huge number of errors. And one of the main scientific challenges in getting this thing to work is controlling the number of errors and getting error correction. Okay, I'll leave this slide up for a moment so you can imagine your future office environment, and talk just a little bit about what quantum computing is and why I think it's so important. Current computers have become fantastically efficient at managing huge amounts of data. And if any of you read The Economist magazine in the UK, last week's edition had a very interesting article on the fact that 2 completely new antibiotics have been developed in MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, through the pure use of artificial intelligence. And they've done that by looking at the millions of compounds which have been found, which have been developed, which could be useful in combating bacteria. And they then compared that with information about the effectiveness of these compounds in different combinations, and they came up with these 2 new antibiotics, which it is hoped will be very effective against super viruses, super bacteria. That, in a normal situation, it's estimated would have taken 8.5 years. They managed to do it in a few days. It's more complicated than that, of course, but just to simplify. So artificial intelligence is really brilliant at that. Quantum computers do something different. If you're familiar with the concept of the qubit, I'll just keep it very simple and then I'll understand it, which is that conventional computers, of course, work on code based on 0 and 1. Quantum computers produce a qubit in which a 0 can be a 1 or a 0 or not, and similarly with the 1. So they can be anything at any one time, and this makes them fantastically efficient at computing problems where there are a huge number of variables. That's where they're most effective. And the place that has the biggest significance is going to be in cryptology, and this is why I think it matters to you. I've been looking at this sort of thing for a few years, and I had a particular briefing on this about a year and a half ago in Abu Dhabi. I was speaking at a financial conference, and I was asked to interview a Spanish professor who's actually running the Abu Dhabi Quantum Laboratory. If you can imagine such a thing, why would Abu Dhabi want to have a quantum laboratory until you think of its geopolitical position, facing Iran, in conflict with some of its neighbors. It's actually had a war in Yemen, of course. And so any device that they can get which would help them with cryptology is going to be very useful. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's also very important work going on in quantum computing in Spain, in Barcelona, the university there, and also in Germany. Deutsche Telekom are looking at it from the perspective of future communications. And over the years that I've been looking at this, the scientists have always been saying to me, yeah, in 10 years, in 10 years. So it's always been kind of 10 years over the horizon. They're not saying that anymore. They're now saying certainly by 2030 and possibly in the next 3 to 5 years. So what are the issues that I think are important here? I'll come back to that in a moment, actually. Let's talk about the issues first. Cryptography protocols, and I don't want to get too technical here, basically works out on the number of prime numbers that can be factored. If you have a big enough number of prime numbers to be factored, then it means that the encryption, the code encryption, is incredibly difficult to break. And that's very important for states, of course, because states will have some of their top secrets, whether it's their intelligence agencies or the relationships with other governments, heavily encrypted. And the best encryption in that sense is thought to take about 10,000 years to decrypt using even supercomputers that we have available today. IBM reckoned that they cracked one of those problems, not in 10,000 years, but in 3 minutes, 20 seconds. So if you've got heavily sensitive information which is encrypted, how safe is it going to be? So this was going to be my next question, but I don't think we have this set up. Let me just talk a little bit about it. So what does this mean? How much sensitive information do you have in your company which is encrypted? If you work in government, probably a pretty high percentage, depending on which ministry you're working in. If you're working in financial services, probably quite a lot of encryption is going to be used in your processes. In other companies, more or less. GDPR perhaps might be encouraging you to have more. But how many of you actually know how much encryption you have in your systems, where it is, and how it's been working? My experience is that very few people working in security in big companies actually know this. How long will it take to replace it? Well, if you think that probably the encryption in your companies has been developed over, let's say, 15, 20 years, then replacing that is going to be a major undertaking and a major investment if you can get it from your seniors. And the other thing you need to be thinking about is regulators, because regulators, particularly in financial services, are already thinking about this sort of thing, particularly in the context of the critical national infrastructure. So why does it matter? Even if you can't answer these questions, you can say, yeah, but it's not coming yet. It's going to be at least 3, 5, might even be 10 years. Why does it matter? Why is it a problem now? The lead-in times you're going to need to replace this, I suggest, are going to be long. The other thing is that we already see signs that certainly states and some criminal actors are stealing data now on the basis that within a given period of years, they will be able to decrypt it easily and it will still have value to them. Now, imagine if you're a Russian in the SVR or the Chinese in one of their intelligence departments, and you can get hold of a cache of CIA material heavily encrypted, which is talking about CIA relations with their agents in China or in Russia. And the Chinese or the Russians can decrypt that and identify the agents and roll up the American operations. That's hugely important. So stuff is being stolen now so that it can be decrypted later. And again, I come back to regulation. You need to be thinking about this now because you don't want the regulators to be thinking about it before you are. Otherwise, you're going to be caught out. So my suggestion would be that if you don't already have somebody in your teams who knows about this, get somebody perhaps, as I would say, a little bit geeky or anaraki, who could be interested, and just say to them, look, would you just follow this subject? Keep your eye on what's happening, particularly on the regulatory aspect, how the science is developing. And then you will have somebody in your company who's actually capable of briefing you. Is any of this new to you, old to you? I mean, people who've heard all of this before? Very, very few. Interesting. Okay. And in fact, I've had, this is not just this audience, talking across Europe, I've got a very similar reaction from people. They don't seem to be too aware of the issues. So that's quantum. I'm going to start with some more questions. Okay, we're talking now about artificial intelligence. Please answer truthfully. Yeah, that's about right, I think. The Italian government blocked ChatGPT, is that right? But for a while has unblocked it now. It's not blocked. Okay, I wasn't asking any of you to admit to a crime then. Okay, most of you, whether you've been using it for business or just for pleasure, actually, because it's very interesting to put different questions. For reasons which are too complicated to explain, I was asked to introduce a meeting in Cagliari on the future of Sardinian literature. Don't ask. And I thought, what the hell am I going to say? I'm an Englishman, I don't speak Sardo. I know nothing about Sardinian literature, but I'm expected to be intelligent. I went to ChatGPT, which produced 10 minutes on Sardinian literature and its possible future. People were deeply, deeply impressed until I said, actually, I had to be honest. I admitted it had been done by ChatGPT, and it was very plausible. Okay, next question. Can't both be true. Okay. And the next question, and then I think we're done. some things do not change. Okay, let's move on. And in fact, in the interests of time, and given that Alessandro Vitali will be talking about AI tomorrow, I'm going to cut that section because I see that I'm already running out of time, and there are some other things that I wanted to say. So let me leave artificial intelligence for the moment and finish in my last 5 minutes. And I'm going to skip quite a lot of slides here, if you don't mind. But you'll have copies of all of these, so you can see what I would have said if I was going to. Okay, this is an old favorite of mine. I spent a lot of time talking to boards in various countries, various industries, and I spent a lot of time also talking to directors' associations in the US and in Brussels, the European Confederation of Board Members, and so on. And what I've got here is some British statistics. If Italian statistics exist, I would very much like to know. But these statistics have been produced by the UK government for about the last 10 years. And again, I'm interested in how they change, not the absolute figures. So in the UK, the people answering the questionnaire are board members, not CISOs, board members. So this is what they claim, okay? And there's a little bit of a dip there with medium businesses, might be something to do with COVID, nobody really knows, but statistically insignificant. And these figures from 2023 show a consistent climb over the last 10 years. They've been getting better and better. I think they started out at around 60. Okay, so there's a dedicated board member, may not be a specialist, may not be a technologist, but he's somebody who has the responsibility. So this is in the UK, and I've excluded small businesses because they won't have somebody. So the statisticians among you will have noticed that something's a bit strange here, don't you think? Because at the top, it seems that almost every board is deeply concerned about cybersecurity, but at the bottom, less than half of medium businesses and 2/3 of large businesses actually have a formal cybersecurity strategy in place. Are there statistics for this in Italy? I've never seen them. Is there a survey done? Could be interesting to carry one out. Manage your top management was my theme there, and I think that the communication between you and your top management is very, very important. I saw that the Clusit report, and sorry, my slides have got mixed up because I went ahead of them. The Clusit report this year talked about the fact that cyber is talked about more and more in Consigli d'amministrazione, and really that's my point. They're doing a lot of talking. What are they actually doing? Because everybody's concerned about cybersecurity, and then they go and make a cup of coffee and call their wife. Who are the people who are actually sitting down saying, what should we do? What investment do we need? Not enough is the answer to that. And then I'll finish, because I've got 1 minute left, on security awareness and culture. Before I show that one, I've got a theory. We have been, I say we collectively in corporate security generally, forever have been really bad at security awareness. Because despite all the work, all the investment, I've seen this in Teams, in Unicredit, in Vodafone, you saw the statistics for the causes of so many breaches, the human factor. So we're not getting through to people somewhere. And I've come to a conclusion. This is the Knowlton theory, okay? There's been far too much focus on security awareness and not on security culture. So what's the difference? Is this just a clever argument? Security awareness is something that is done to staff by security people. And what is the problem with security people? Well, there are two that I can mention here. The first one is that we tend to see things in black and white. It's either right or it's wrong. And the second thing is that security people are not naturally educators. So what do security people do? They tend to look for an easy solution to teaching their staff or the staff of the company how to do security. And what they very often do is buy an online course which every member of staff has to do every 6 months. They get the green tick, the statistics go to the board. We have security awareness covered. Unfortunately, guys, we all know that it doesn't work like that. What you need is actually an all-company approach to creating a culture. And I'm sorry, I don't have time to go into this, but I've seen it done in health and safety, and I've also seen it do in corporate ethics in different companies, as well as in security. And the only way you develop a culture is by having this all-company approach in which the top management is absolutely crucial. Health and safety in Vodafone, we were getting 15 years ago, 30 or 35 people a year were dying because of engineering accidents of one sort or another. The board, Vittorio Colau, decided this is simply unacceptable. We will stop it. And there was a huge drive sustained over several years to change the culture. And my word, did it have an effect. And the way that it was done was in various different ways. For example, at each board meeting, they went through the people who'd been seriously injured or killed in that month with photographs about their families. Each case became human. It wasn't just a statistic. And then that was driven through the workforce. And it got to the stage, for example, and it happened to me twice, once in Ghana, once in India. I got into a company car with a driver to be taken somewhere, and he would not switch on the engine because I did not have my seatbelt done up. It had become in the DNA of the company, and that's something that we need to drive. It involves HR, it involves IT in two ways, because I was going to talk about security by design, but security needs to be designed also into IT processes. You need to sit down with users and see how users are using the process. Similarly, with the hardware, there's a lot of really interesting research going on. I can talk about it later in behavioral psychology that started by looking at how people operated in tanks and fast jets, how they use the instruments. And just by making changes, sometimes in where things appeared on the screen, you could resolve something that was regularly leading to a security gap. Security, of course, have to be involved. Internal communications, because they're the guys who are supposed to be good at communicating with staff. Finance, because they're going to have to pay for this. And legal, because you need to know what you can and can't say and where your focus should be. So, I'm sorry, I've drastically overrun. I'm going to stop there. I wanted to talk about security operations and say some unpleasant things to Italians. And perhaps I'll just say two things. It disappoints me, guys, that I don't meet Italians like you in international conferences. I chaired an international conference in Berlin for 3 successive years on OT, operational technology, IoT. In those 3 years, there was one Italian, and that was a woman who'd come from the EU Commission. I think it's a pity if you're not coming. I know you'll have problems. Perhaps your CEO doesn't want to give you a budget to go for Brussels for a week. They think you're wasting your time. But I think that international exposure is really, really important. The light's flashing. Thank you very much for your attention.